Winter has always been a time for gathering in the longhouse and sharing information around the fire. This is our contribution to that tradition. It's a pretty doggone warm morning this morning. The elk were headed back to their beds before the sun even came up, which is a good indicator that it's actually, relatively speaking, a pretty warm day. Unlike elk, we don't have as many natural features to buffer ourselves from the elements, and so we have clothing, thankfully. So in a lot of ways we can do a lot more environmentally than the animals can. But to understand what the requirements are for maintaining that constant body temperature year-round, we kind of have to go a little bit into vertebrate zoology. And probably the best primer is a book called How Animals Work, and I'd recommend everybody read it. Probably the most significant factor related to people is the mismatch between volume and surface area. Basically, as an object gets larger, surface area is going up as a square function, whereas volume is going up as a cubic function. This means that the ratio between volume and surface area is not constant. The ratio is changing, and it's changing geometrically. So the larger you are, the more you have both a heating, the more you have a cooling problem, and the smaller you are, the more you have a heating problem. So, and you can see in where your people are from. If your people spent a long time evolving in the upper latitudes, relatively speaking, they're going to have small surface area relative to their volume. You look at the Athabascan peoples, the Diné, the Apache. They live in the desert now, but they came down from the Arctic pretty recently. So you look at their bodies, short, broad bodies, squat. That's an adaptation for cold weather. So how is it that the human body adapts to cooling, or adapts to hot temperatures? It's evaporation. We have sweat, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So there's four primary ways that heat is lost. First is radiant, second is convective, third is conductive, and fourth is evaporative. So radiant is just simply I'm sitting here, my body's producing heat, metabolic functions, the heat's radiating outwards, I'm losing it. The second is convective. Wind comes through and swirls around me, and it will much more quickly cause me to lose heat. And then conductive means when I touch an object, if the object is colder than I am, it's going to suck the warmth right out of that appendage. So when we're moving, that's not a huge factor other than our feet, and then if we're handling ski poles or any kind of equipment, a firearm, our hands. Once we come to a stop, we have to be aware of that. I'm sitting on my pack here because I don't want to get all of the heat sucked out of my body into the ground. And then finally evaporative, which I touched on earlier. Evaporative is a huge factor. Basically what evaporative cooling does is it accelerates the cooling process as moisture evaporates, and it is our primary function for temperature regulation. Unfortunately, we're kind of still geared towards when we had a coat like an elk. So usually our evaporative cooling function is working far overtime. So, even if it's 0 degrees out, like it was a couple days ago when I was out skiing, even at 0 degrees, my body is producing sweat. It wants to cool itself. It says, hey, we're about to have a heat overload event here because of the amount of work that's being done, and we gotta start dumping heat, and so we're going to produce sweat to do that. So that's a very significant factor. So what we find in at least the sort of arid environments that we roam is that radiant's obvious. Oh, it's cold outside, throw on a heavy insulation layer. But the problem is that we got to balance that whole evaporative function as well. So what we find is that the two biggest factors you have to manage with clothing is convective, or wind. The wind is almost always moving in the mountains and in the deserts that we roam. Wind, and evaporative cooling. So sort of in the classic 80s, 90s, we developed this base layer, mid layer, and shell. And we layer up and down for the temperatures, and what we found, and again, you know, our bodies are built for the freezing temperatures, so we're going to skew towards maybe a different direction than some of you folks watching this. But what we found is that you need to think in terms of base layer and shell when you're moving, and that's it. Insulation has an important function, but that's for when you come to a stop. Insulation is almost always too much when we're moving. So what we end up doing is varying the thickness of our base layer and our shell to match the environment, and insulation just becomes something that goes on over everything. So let me start with shells. So waterproof, breathable. There's actually no such thing as waterproof, breathable. What you actually have is a continuum from completely breathable on one end and barely to no waterproofing at all to waterproof on the other end. So on the waterproof end, you have things like Helly Hansen, Improtec, Grundens, you know, the rubberized materials. They actually are waterproof with respect to the outside environment. The problem being there's no breathability there at all. So if you're relatively static, metabolic functions are low, you're not necessarily going to be producing so much moisture from the inside, and so maybe you're better off with that completely waterproof layer because you're more worried about moisture coming in. On the far other end, you have sort of the wind shirts. You know, you've got the Arc'teryx Wraith, cuts the wind very well, cuts moisture reasonably well, is pretty breathable, although that one saunas out just a little bit. Another great shell on that end is the Outdoor Research Feroce material. Very breathable, cuts the wind reasonably well, and sheds moisture well. And then of course the wind cheater available from First Spear, and then we kind of have our version as well. That's relative to those other two, a little bit less breathable. The material itself, it's more durable, but it cuts the wind very well, and the waterproofing's pretty good as well. And then in the middle, you know, between the wind shells and the truly waterproof layers, you have the quote-unquote waterproof breathables. Gore-Tex, of course, was the original. It's relatively waterproof. It is not very breathable. If you're moving much at all, you're going to overwhelm it, and you're going to be much wetter from the inside out than you ever would be from the outside in. There are newer materials, Event, as well as Polartec NeoShell, which are closer to the breathable end. So they are, for something that's waterproof, they're very breathable. They don't approach a layer like this. Well, they almost approach a layer like this. There's a noticeable difference, but they're breathable enough that if you're a high moisture output person, you can still get by with using them in a lot of temperatures, a lot of conditions. And at the same time, they're considerably more waterproof than something like this. So if the wind is a significant factor, you might be better off with a shell like that than a shell like this. But the downside is Event NeoShell, not as waterproof as Gore-Tex. So you have this whole continuum, and you're basically going to have to figure out what shell layer works for you the best based on two factors. One is the amount of moisture in the outside environment that you typically encounter, and the other is the amount of moisture that your specific body produces, because the goal is to stay as dry as possible overall relative to the body, which is producing moisture, and the outside environment, which presumably is adding moisture. So that's sort of shells. Now, some things to look for in shells. I like mechanical ventilation. That makes a huge difference. Big old pit zips, you can dump a whole lot of moisture underneath your underarms without really exposing your body to the outside environment. So one huge advantage of our wind cheater and First Spear's wind cheater is pit zips. That's unusual in a wind shell, but it is incredibly useful. You're up in the high country, you know, it could be 50 degrees, but the wind's blowing like a son of a gun. You're needing to dump moisture, but you still need protection from that convective cooling. So that's a real handy feature. Big cuffs that you can open up and get some mechanical ventilation through that is nice. A full zip, you know, you can unzip underneath your pack and open up. That's helpful. And on the other end of things, a hood is absolutely essential. Again, convective cooling. It's real hard to do enough with stocking caps and head layers to really protect from that convective cooling versus, you know, you see me wearing a ball cap, which I'll wear, you know, even down into the single digits, but with a hood over it because I'm producing enough heat that I need to vent, but I need that convective protection. The longer it is, the better. Back in the 90s, outer shells started being influenced by mountaineering. Everybody was going to be a mountaineer, and if you have a climbing harness on, you need a relatively short-waisted jacket. If you're not wearing a climbing harness, man, it might as well be down to your knees as far as the value of having that layer. And there's not really a lot on the market like that, but that's something to look for. So that's shells for you. You've got a continuum from completely waterproof to completely breathable. Pick something in between that's matched to your environment. And the amount of moisture that you output. All right, so base layers. And you know, it's funny, there's orthodoxies that come and go as far as what base layers work the best, but look at it this way. The point of a base layer is to get moisture off of your skin. Evaporative cooling is very significant, and if you have, you know, a side note there, there is one other strategy to mitigate evaporative cooling, and that is literally to move so slowly that you don't produce sweat, that your body never kicks in and says, hey, we're gonna have a heat event. If you are in a survival situation, that may be exactly what you need to do. You know, if it's cold outside, do not ever move quickly enough to produce that moisture so it never becomes a problem. For the most part, we're not in a survival situation. We're actually moving more aggressively. We're gonna be producing sweat. And so you want a base layer that manages that. So what you're wanting to do basically is get the moisture off of your skin so that you don't have evaporative cooling taking place next to your skin. And then you want to do something with that moisture once it's kind of to the outside of the base layer. Now, if you're using it in concert with a shell, that works pretty well because you've got a somewhat slow process of moisture coming off the outside of your base layer through your shell, and then and the shell is buffering that effect, sort of like the elk's fur does. It's going to buffer that evaporative cooling effect so that it's not as rapid and not as extreme. So as far as base layer materials are concerned, like I said earlier, I like to vary the thickness of the base layer to the environment. In shoulder season and winter trips, I'm probably going to be carrying a couple of different base layers, to kind of match to what time of day it is, and I'll switch out. My rule of thumb, though, is that I never want to end up with more wet garments, more wetter garments, then I can dry off in my sleeping bag overnight. If you're rocking a wood stove, heated shelter, yeah, you can dry. Even that's not awesome because you're producing condensation inside, and there's a whole lot of variables there. But at the end of the day, what you can rely on is drying clothing in your sleeping bag if you have a good sleep system. And so, how much wet clothing do you really want in your sleeping bag with you? To me, I never want my insulation layer to be wet. I can deal with a wet base layer. Shells dry very quickly. There's not a lot of moisture that's held in a shell. And so between a wet base layer, because I've managed throughout the day, and a wet shell, by the next morning, and wet socks, by the next morning I've got a reset and I'm doing all right. As far as base layer materials are concerned, you know, there's the old saying, cotton kills. Cotton doesn't actually kill. What cotton does is it dries very, very quickly. So what are the implications of something that dries very, very quickly? It speeds evaporative cooling. In the summertime, that is a fantastic feature. You know, in the summertime we use like 60% cotton, 40% you know, nylon or synthetic in a very, very thin layer, the classic cowboy shirt, because what that does is, first of all, it actually provides a little bit of wind protection because it's so tightly woven, but it speeds evaporative cooling. It actually cools you off better than any synthetic that you might be able to use. On the flip side, you have wool, which, you know, everybody says, oh, wool insulates even when it's wet, etc., etc. What wool actually does is it dries very, very slowly. So it mitigates that evaporative cooling. So, you know, it's not that, I mean, you're going to have a wet, if you're using wool as a base layer and you go into your sleeping bag, it's probably still going to be wet the next morning, which becomes a huge factor. And I'll go into the properties of wool in more detail when I talk about insulation in a moment. But anyway, the bottom line is that synthetics just work way better. They get the moisture off of the skin. They dry quickly enough. They don't dry so quickly that they speed up evaporative cooling. You're going to have a dry layer an hour or two after it gets wet, as long as you're in relatively low humidity environment, and it's extremely robust. Oh, you know, one point on wool is lanolin. Lanolin helps with the wet feature of wool, but it's not a rabbit hole that we've gone very far down, simply because wool, relative to its weight, is also not very warm. So, you know, why even mess with it when you've got synthetics, which are lightweight and warm and are going to outperform wool. So, you know, what synthetic layers do we like? Honestly, that's kind of a commodity item, you know, meaning buy it anywhere. The nicer synthetics mitigate the smell problem. Synthetics, you know, classically have this issue that, you know, you sweat in them and, you know, for several days they're going to start smelling real bad, which wool does not have. Nicer synthetics don't, but you know, like our Can't Cheat the Mountain long sleeve shirt, that's actually a pretty nice synthetic layer. You go down to Sam's Club or Costco or buy whatever the heck they're selling, that stuff works well. One of the base layers that I'll use in the wintertime a lot is something that Sam's Club calls Omni Wool. It's actually like 10% wool, so you know, it's got just enough wool to mitigate evaporative cooling, but for the most part it's just a good synthetic base layer, and it sells for under 20 bucks. You know what the heck, buy 3 of them, rotate them out. You know, it's a good way to go. So as far as thickness is concerned, you know, when it's cooler or warmer temperatures, summertime, you know, I'll either be wearing the cowboy shirt as a base layer or a relatively lightweight synthetic top. It gets colder, I'll switch to like a mid to quote-unquote winter weight base layer. And then in really cold temperatures, and by that, well, really cold, that's all relative, but in temperatures where the daily high is going to be no higher than the teens, something that I've been experimenting with for a couple seasons that works very well is a very thin fleece layer. Examples would be the Arc'teryx Naga hoodie. The one that I've been using is made by Cabela's, and I think it's called maybe a Lewis Creek or Lewiston pullover. The stuff made out of Polartec grid fleece. Basically what all of these have in common is that they are a very, very thin fleece with a hard face on the outside, which sort of mitigates that evaporative cooling, but with fleece on the inside, which pulls the moisture off of your skin very quickly. And that's actually been working out really well for me for the past couple seasons. A word of caution, you do not want to wear a base layer underneath it, because what's going to happen is whatever that base layer is, it's actually going to keep the moisture on your skin, and it's not going to let the fleece pull the moisture off of your skin the way it does if you're wearing it next to your bare skin. So that's kind of, you know, at the extreme, that's a winter base layer that I'll use. And, you know, like, I want to say it was low teens up here this morning, and it's probably going to be damn near freezing, which is really warm when you're in the direct sun today. So, you know, if this were a backpacking trip that I was out on, I'd probably be carrying both that winter weight layer and a lighter weight layer, and I'd start off in the morning wearing the winter weight layer and switch out, you know, once it warmed up for that lighter layer. Just making sure that neither one got overwhelmed with sweat at the same time, so I could still abide by that rule of making sure I can get all my stuff dry every night. So that's base layers. So the next thing is insulation. Now, like I said before, you know, our findings have been you never really end up wearing insulation between your base layer and your shell, kind of no matter how cold the temperatures are. But you know, remember that thing about surface area to volume. If you're somebody whose body was, you know, evolved in the middle latitudes, where you actually have a lot of surface area relative to your volume, you might be in the camp where you need that insulation layer. Your body practically never kicks over and starts producing sweat, and so evaporative cooling's not a factor. You know, so that's something you're going to have to discover for yourself. But boy, there's a whole lot of people out there for whom, you know, this idea of no, don't ever wear that insulating layer is a revelation, because they've been following the classic advice and kept getting cold. Because there's nothing worse than pulling into camp because you've been sweating in some kind of mid layer all day, and you've got a completely wet mid layer, like your insulation's compromised, and you've got too much water stored in that thing to even dry it off overnight. So let me talk about insulation materials. Now I'm going to go in order of descending warmth to weight ratio, because we're talking about muscle powered activities, so you want the most bang for your buck. You want the most warmth for the weight that you can get. So the king of this is down, but not just any down. Specifically, you've got to have, well, to be on top, you've got to have a minimum of 750 fill power down. That has the absolute best warmth to weight ratio of any insulation. It's very compressible. It's also one real nice property of down is that it tends to be comfortable across a wider range of temperatures. And if you're using it in that mode of I'm not sweating in it, but I'm throwing it on over a shell when I get to a place where I need to, you know, I'm not moving, I'm not producing heat, and I need to conserve whatever heat I've got on my body. That means you're not really getting that down warm. If you're moving in wet, if you're moving in sub-zero temperatures consistently and throwing it on in sub-zero temperatures, your down's not going to get wet. So that thing about down not conserving warmth when it's wet just really isn't even a factor. The other thing with down is that modern shell materials have gotten so nice with respect to water repellency that you can kind of expect your down layer to stay dry even with a little bit of outside moisture going on. The new dry downs, to my way of thinking, the jury is still out on those. You know, the sales pitch is that the down is coated in such a way that it can't get wet and it retains its warmth, or the down itself cannot get wet, so overall the insulation layer retains its warmth even when it's wet. My question then becomes, okay, but how much weight did you add? Well, first of all, does it really work? Second of all, how much weight did you really add? Do you now have a garment that's the same weight as the next tier down, so it's not actually any warmer per weight. But at any rate, warmth to weight, 750 fill power down is the absolute king, still is. Just below that is what we absolutely prefer, which is Primaloft Gold. Primaloft Gold is a synthetic insulation. It retains a crazy amount of its warmth when it's wet, something like 95% or something. It is warmth per weight ratio. It's not as good as down, but it's really good. It's very compressible. It's just a fantastic insulation layer. That's what our Mountain Serape is made out of, and that's something to look for. A note there, though, I'm talking only about Primaloft Gold, not Eco, not Silver, not Sport. You know, none of those. They don't have those same properties. So if it's not Primaloft Gold, it's not what I'm talking about here. I understand that the Arc'teryx, I don't remember what the heck they call it, their proprietary insulation has nearly the same properties of Primaloft Gold, so that's good stuff. And there might be some other, you know, proprietary private label insulations that have those properties. I don't know what they are. I do know that Primaloft Gold is good to go. Below Primaloft Gold, you get into the downs that are like, say, 650 fill power and below. Once you get below 650 fill power, the warmth per weight's not even as good as Primaloft Gold. So there's really no point, unless, I don't know, at least for backcountry travel where you're really trying to optimize, there's no point in down that's below 650 fill power, because it's not nearly as good as synthetic in terms of warmth to weight, and then it's still got the Achilles heel of when it gets wet, it loses, oh boy, you know, there's people who know these numbers off the top of their head, but I think down loses like 60% of its insulation property when it gets wet. So below that down, in terms of warmth per weight, is all the other insulations. Your Clima Shields, some of your no-name synthetic insulations, you know, warmth per weight. They're not, you know, they're not nearly as warm per weight as Primaloft Gold is, and surprisingly, a lot of people think, oh well, you know, it's still a synthetic. It's warm when it's wet. They actually, when they're wet, things like Clima Shield are much closer to down in the amount of warmth that they retain compared to their dry state. So they're not really a great performer when it comes to wet performance. But you know, as long as you keep them dry, warmth per weight, you know, is pretty decent on them. And you know, I'm going to just throw it in there, cotton jersey. You know, I don't know where exactly it falls in the continuum, but like the classic sweatshirt, you know, it's not a bad performer as long as you keep it dry. So, you know, again, the cotton kills. Well, cotton kills if a big thick layer of it gets wet and then dries very quickly. But if you can keep your cotton dry, it's not like it's a horrible insulator either. Then as far as warmth to weight ratio, wool's the bottom of the heap. It's incredibly heavy for the amount of warmth that it produces. And the old misnomer about it staying warm when it's wet, it certainly retains more warmth when it's wet than cotton does, but not much. I mean, it's well, and better than down too, but it's you know, it's kind of like those low-end synthetic insulations when it gets wet. And I don't remember, you know, it's like 60 or 70% or something like that. And remember that it dries very, very slowly. So if you can keep wool dry, yeah, it does great. But then, you know, you get it wet either due to sweat or due to outside precipitation, and now it's doing, you know, not nearly as much for you as it was dry. So, you know, when there were no synthetic insulations, wool was kind of as good as it got. And again, the wool with the lanolin, even better if you can still get that. But for muscle powered travel, there's just no percentage in it. It is too flippin' heavy. And you know, yeah, we used to rock the those awesome Russian wool pants. I think that they weighed like 8 pounds a piece or something, and you know, like waterproof knee material, and you know, they were awesome. But criminy, you wear 20 pounds of clothing, that's going to slow you down. You know, that and a nice Filson wool jacket. If you're riding a horse or something, or driving around in a car, it looks styling, and it's cool, but you know, adding that much weight in clothing really ends up slowing you down. So we stay away from wool for any kind of real world use. So that is insulation layers. So what kind of insulation layers are useful? Oh, and you know, there's something I need to go into here that's part of insulation, is the soft shell. So the soft shell was really kind of a neat idea. That said, you know what, we're going to bind an insulating layer, so a classic mid layer, with some kind of shell layer, something that's on that continuum is a little bit closer to a waterproof breathable than it is to a straight up wind shell. So what we think of as soft shell material it sheds water really well, it cuts the wind really well, and it's bonded to this fleece insulating layer. What's the downside of that? Man, it is usually way too hot, and when you get it wet, and it's also very heavy, and when you get it wet, it's gonna take a long time for that thing to dry. So, you know, initially I got excited about soft shells, and I had a really lightweight soft shell. When they first came out, they were really thin and lightweight, that performed pretty well, but you know, what you think of now as soft shells, they're just not really a good outdoor garment for any kind of movement. Static, yeah, fine, whatever. A town coat, you know, they work, it's a good concept. But for actually moving, unless it's a really thin, you know, one of the really thin ones, and you don't produce much moisture, and you know, if you're one of those people who doesn't produce much moisture, that soft shell over the right base layer might be a good choice for you. For our purposes, not useful. So what kind of properties do we look for in an insulating layer? Well, so you've got your torso and your legs to think about. You know, our mountain serape is a garment that covers torso and legs. So if like us, you found that throwing insulation on over everything when you come to a stop is a good thing, mountain serape is great because one layer covers, you can even throw it on over a small pack, throw it on over your kit bag, it covers everything, and it works out pretty well. Something else that we will add in the winter, even in addition to that, is insulated full zip overpants. Those are kind of hard to come by in a nice lightweight packable Primaloft Gold Factor, but those are available if you look around, and that's something that we use. Something else like an over parka, particularly, you know, if you're going to be up above timberline in the wind, and huge winds are really a factor, then an overcoat, you know, again, as long as you can get it, the classic belay jacket, that becomes a useful layer. And you know, really what we're looking for is not a whole bunch of layers. Every time you add zippers, every time you add, you know, closure systems, you add more pockets, whatever it is, all you're doing is adding weight. Like the inner shell and the outer shell, there's weight there. So what we're looking for is all the insulation you need in a single layer. Remember, we're not layering up and down, we're just coming to a rest stop and needing all the insulation we have, in essence. And so, you know, what you'll find, really the mountain serape, you know, kind of eat your own dog food. I use that year round, and I found that I actually kind of prefer it to other insulating layers for backpacking. But anyway, the point is, I've used that on trips where that was my only insulating layer other than the pants I talked about, you know, down into the single digits. Below that, you know, probably you're adding more, but you know, that's been my experience, and you'll just have to find, you know, what works for you as far as what insulating layer you want to be able to throw on over. Now, a word about your legs. Legs don't sweat as much as the torso, so you can get by with warmer, basically warmer stuff, because the evaporative cooling is not an issue. So the soft shell that I was just dogging earlier, for pants, we love soft shells. They don't overheat. They don't end up holding a bunch of moisture. They end up being a really nice compromise between breathability, windproofness, waterproofness, some insulation. So particularly in the winter, you're going to see us using soft shell pants. And in the summer, you know, some of the more synthetic oriented pants. So that's nice. We like the soft shell pants. Okay, so let's talk about appendages. Hands, we'll start with hands. So you see me wearing, what the military calls contact gloves. The point of the contact gloves is to be able to touch things without conductive heat loss. So we use these outdoor research Nomex gloves with leather palms. They're enough dexterity to use small stuff, shoot with. They're warm enough if you're moving, and these are good year-round. Once it starts getting colder, they don't offer enough insulation. That's a situation where instead of putting on heavier gloves, we layer up. And the reason is you got to maintain that dexterity. You can't be in the situation of like, oh, here's my heavy gloves, but I got to pull them off to do something, and now I'm touching something metal with bare hands and just sucking the heat right out of my hands. So a couple different things we'll do that work really well. One is rag wool fingerless gloves. You get big stretchy ones, you can put them on right over your contact gloves, and they maintain heat out to about here, and you've still got the dexterity. That's a good solution. If you're having trouble with the digits, it may not be everything. The other thing is that if you can find mittens, and I think the ones I use are probably Outdoor Research, not with heavy liners, because you run into all sorts of problems with, you get moisture in there, the liners get stuck, you can't get your fingers in there. But the over mitts that I use come up to here. They have a lightweight fleece liner sewn into them, and I got them in the absolute largest size I could. So basically you throw your mittens on over your contact gloves, and by virtue of your fingers being together and a little bit of sewn in insulation, they'll keep you real warm. And you kind of want tethers. Scott uses the real old school like mitten tethers that come around his neck. Throw your mittens off and they're hanging there. You can also, if you can tie them into your jacket somewhere, the waterproof breathable mountain parka that we're working on actually has tabs to tie your mittens into for exactly that reason. You don't want to drop it in the snow. 3 feet of snow, if it's powder snow, it goes to the bottom. That's not a good thing. So that's kind of the hand thing. Gloves that maintain dexterity, wool fingerless gloves over or mittens over is a system that we've found that works well for backcountry travel. The head. So there's the old saw about whatever percentage of body heat going through the head, and I think that was based on a test that has since been somewhat disproven. But the bottom line is through your neck and through your head you will lose a fair amount of heat. But you've got the evaporative cooling factor as well. So you put on a heavy stocking cap, if you're going to produce a whole bunch of moisture into your stocking cap, eventually that's going to start biting you in the butt. So I use relatively light, I'll be wearing this ball cap a lot of the time when I'm moving, with or without a hood. I do have a Polartec grid fleece beanie that sometimes I'll throw on if it's real cold instead of this, but that's kind of it. And then then a hood like this, and then I like my insulation layer to have a hood as well. So I throw on the insulation layer, throw on that hood, and I've got like big old insulation layer over my head, and that works really well. So what's with the coyote ruff? Real fur ruffs have a very important property. You go for a hike, you go for a run in cold temperatures, and you start coughing, that's the start of pneumonia in your lungs. You do not want to be pushing, or like the ice beard. Ice beard looks cool as hell. If you got much ice build up on your beard, that means that you've been damaging your lungs. That means your face hasn't consistently been warm enough to preheat the air coming into your lungs, and you've been damaging your lungs. If you're just on a day trip, fine, you sleep at night and it's fine, your lungs recover whatever in a house. But if you're out in the backcountry, that can become a problem. The function of a fur ruff is that it will preheat the air that you're breathing before it hits your lungs. So I've, even in relatively warm temperatures, 40 degrees, but the wind's blowing really hard. Certainly once you get down into the 20s, even if my body is warm, I'm going to be wearing this to preheat the air before it hits my lungs so that my lungs feel good. And mean, you can test this. You go out and push super hard, just breathing heavy, the bellows are just going and going, and you got no cough whatsoever if you're using something like this. A balaclava that protects your face is another strategy for that, but then you get condensation issues on the outside of it, and it's kind of hard to mess with. So this actually is a great point for that. And a lot of people say, oh, I want the fur ruff on my insulation layer. Well, you know, like I've talked about, you don't move with the insulation layer. That's too hot. So it ends up being really good to have the fur ruff on whatever your shell is, and when you throw on your insulation layer over it, you still got the benefit of the fur ruff with the insulation outside. Fur also in a driving blizzard, you know, nowadays we have goggles and things like that, but if you're in a driving blizzard, the fur around your face will actually keep that snow out of your eyes, out of your face, so you can still see, you can maintain, you know, some ability to look, some mobility, and so there's a whole lot to that fur ruff that just can't be solved any other way. And you know, God bless the coyotes who are supplying our fur for us. You know, we thank them for that, and it works, and so that's what we use. So that's the head, and then finally the feet. Like I said, you've got your conduction, heat loss through conduction. So you know, that's a factor. The warm winter socks really do work, really do help. I've been experimenting with the super feet. I think they call them hunting insoles, but they're wool. They are a little bit warmer, but then they get wet. So you know, if I'm just doing day trips, not a big issue. Multi-day trips, I use 2 pair of them so I can have one out. I mean, at the very minimum, if I only have 1 pair, I'll take the insoles out and put them in my sleeping bag overnight to hopefully dry them. Oftentimes they still have some moisture in the morning, so I'm moving towards carrying 2 pairs, so I've got like a full 1-day rotation to get into fully dry insoles, and hopefully the others dry out in my pack, but they will add some warmth. One final trick that I'll talk about that works really well is the vapor barrier, on the feet anyway, is the vapor barrier liner. So the concept there is that you put a absolutely waterproof bag over your feet, and your skin reaches an equilibrium in terms of moisture, and maybe stops producing as much moisture, but it holds a lot of heat in. So if you have uninsulated boots, and boots for winter travel is a whole different subject, we'll do a different video on that, but if you're just trying to keep your feet warm, a trick you can use is the vapor barrier liner, and the cheapest ones are like newspaper bags or bread bags, and you basically put them on. What I really prefer is a pair of liner socks, the vapor barrier liner, and then a nice pair of wool socks, or you know, warm socks over that. You know, like the Thorlo Trekkers, the mountaineering ones, the ski ones, nice and warm. Lots of loft to those socks, and that will significantly extend the range of a pair of boots down into the cold temperatures. So I carry a pair of newspaper bags and liner socks, which typically I don't use liner socks at all, but I carry the liner socks and the newspaper bags year round, because if I get in a pinch and my feet are cold, conditions deteriorate, I've got an easy way to keep my feet warm, keep myself mobile, and so that's a good trick. As far as boots for winter travel, well, footwear period, that is a whole other topic, and we will certainly cover that, but you know, the bottom line is on your feet, in addition to the bread bag trick, in addition to using warm socks, moisture management. So you're going to want to carry spare socks. The colder it is, the wetter it is, the more spare socks you want to carry. You always, always, always want a dry base layer on top and a dry pair of socks you can put on. And if you get to the point that all of your socks and all of your base layers are wet, stop moving. You got to stop. You got to maintain your ability to keep going, and that means getting that stuff dry, whatever that takes. So you don't wait until, oh, I need a dry layer and now I'm screwed because I haven't kept my layers dry. It's already a problem. If you get to the point that you have no dry layers, it's time to stop and solve that problem before you do anything else. So, you know, oftentimes you'll switch out socks throughout the day to keep them dry. If you got a sunny day like this, maybe you've got a pair drying on the outside of your pack. You certainly dry out in your sleeping bag, whatever socks you've got. At night, you always go into the sleeping bag with a dry base layer and a dry pair of socks. Never do you want even the, you may think that your socks and base layer are dry at night, and unless they are bone dry, you're actually going to get kind of cold in your sleeping bag. So usually just whatever layers you've maintained as dry are the ones to put on. You know they're bone dry. Shove the others in the bottom of your sleeping bag. They'll dry out overnight. So that's it. I've covered the importance of, basically the shell to mitigate convective cooling and also buffer that evaporative cooling. I've talked about base layers, which have a primary function of handling the evaporative cooling effect in a smart way. I've talked about insulation layers and the various properties of the different materials and sort of the ways that we use insulation layers. I've talked about using mechanical ventilation to help manage the evaporative cooling effect. I've talked about some special cases for your hands, for your feet, and for your head. And one other point that I'll mention, gaiters. Gaiters in the winter are good. They keep your lower legs dry, and they keep the snow out. They'll give you a little bit of warming effect. So those are nice to have. But anyway, I've talked about feet, head, hands, the special factors there, and that whole gamut of stuff applies year-round. The winter is when it's easier to think about it because things are more critical, but the same principles apply in the summer. And remember, it's about your body, your surface to volume ratio, the amount of sweat that you output, and then the environment that you find yourself in. The amount of moisture, the amount of wind in that environment, and then also, how much evaporative cooling due to humidity. So come up with a good system. It's going to take some experimentation, but that's part of the fun. Get out there, figure out what works for you, and be safe along the way.